Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan Shannon. I am the Deputy Director for Smart Energy Consumer Collaborative, and welcome to today's edition of our COVID interviews on helping consumers through this time. We're happy to be joined with us today from Liz Coyle from Georgia Watch. She's the Executive Director there. We're going to talk to Liz a little bit about what she's seen from consumers, their concerns, their needs during this time, and how to address those. So Liz, thank you for being with us today. First, I want to just give you a second to talk a little bit about Georgia Watch and your role there, and maybe how that role has changed over the last few months during the pandemic.
Happy to do that, Nathan, and it's good to be with you today to talk about these important issues facing Georgians and all Americans in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis we're all dealing with. As you said, I'm Executive Director of Georgia Watch. I'm also Vice Chair of the SECC board, and have enjoyed being able to work with my colleagues in the consumer protection as well as utility spaces. So Georgia Watch is a statewide consumer advocacy organization. We work on issues that we feel have a tremendous impact on consumers' quality of life. And those are really pocketbook issues, from obviously utilities are a big part of that, to medical bills and access to quality, affordable health care, access to safe, stable housing, broad financial protection issues. We work to promote policies that prevent predatory lending to consumers, and also to help consumers improve their financial literacy and have more access to financial mainstream.
All right, thanks, Liz. Now, thank you for giving us a little bit of insight into your role there. Have you seen a shift in what you're working on over the last few months, and talk to us a little bit about the concerns that consumers have brought to you and what you've heard?
Well, like everybody, dealing with this incredibly rare and unusual situation. I mean, these types of pandemics happen once every 100 years, and everybody has had to pivot. There are the simple things from, we've all learned to do things by, as we're doing now, Zoom or some other virtual meeting platform. Our offices are still closed. But what hasn't changed is our toll-free number. We have a consumer hotline, and we have been getting a tremendous volume of calls. Many of the issues relate to, some are calling because they still haven't gotten their unemployment benefits. Some are calling because they want to understand whether they can access care related to testing for the virus, or if they happen to have it, what can they, where can they go for care that they can afford. By far, the majority of calls we've gotten, the second highest is people who are facing eviction from their housing. The number one calls that we get are from customers facing shutoff from their utilities. And we really have, our work, the work of a consumer advocate certainly is just doubled down on in a time like this. This is a time when people are feeling an incredible fear and pain because of this economic crisis that's tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we've done a lot of advocacy at the federal level around what do Georgia consumers need to make it through this economic crisis. And we also know in particular that communities of color are much more disparately impacted, and our focus in our work is really race equity, and how do we ensure that all Georgians, but particularly those who have in the energy space face the highest energy burden, which tends to be lower income communities of color. How do we make sure that resources get to the people who need it the most, and policies and relief gets to the people who need it the most?
Yeah, it's definitely something that has been top of mind for many consumer advocates. Like you said, it's doubling down, so much more work for you guys to do. We appreciate everything you do for the customers. So Liz, you mentioned that one of the biggest assets to customers from your organization is the toll-free number to call in and get advice and get guidance and education and counseling around dealing with energy issues and financial issues. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the experiences customers are having and what you're hearing on those calls?
Absolutely. And we've gotten calls to our toll-free number from people having questions about access to health care, concerns about taking out predatory loans. by far, the number of calls that we've gotten this summer have been from consumers who are worried about having their utilities cut off in the middle of a pandemic. And in many cases, consumers, were relieved when they found out that their utility was suspending shutoffs during the time that the citizens of the state were under an order to stay home and shelter in place. But once the utilities started lifting that shutoff suspension, we began getting calls from consumers who were suddenly expected to pay maybe even $1,000 or more in an amount that they owed, and they didn't have a way of coming up with that. Many Georgians are still waiting for their unemployment benefits to come through. A lot of people are still out of work. And so we heard from one consumer who's served by a municipal utility who couldn't come up with $500 in the middle of July to keep the lights on. And he's now living in the dark. He has diabetes. He can't keep his insulin refrigerated. He's been eating SpaghettiOs out of a can. So there's some really heartbreaking stories. And then we have examples of certainly of people who have been served by Georgia Power who were able to work out payment plans. Georgia Power and the Georgia Public Service Commission took steps to lift the shutoff moratorium in mid-July, in part because they were concerned about the amount of debt that was building up. But they said to their customers, we want to work with you. We call us and we'll work out a payment plan. You can start paying what you owe from those months of the shutoff suspension in October, which really makes a lot of sense because in October, people's power bills start to go down because it's not as hot and you're not using your air conditioning as much and you haven't started using your heat yet. So people can pay that amount from the March to July timeframe between October and April. What we know is that different utilities are approaching this differently. And that's part of the reason we're hearing from consumers who are just confused. They don't know. They don't know that one utility is allowing you to work out payment plans that don't start out right away. And some of them really didn't understand during the time of the suspension that ultimately they were going to need to pay those power bills. So it's really been challenging, and people are already feeling, as you would, we're all anxious in the midst of the pandemic and the economic crisis associated with it, and having to worry about whether or not you're going to be able to keep your home with electricity and gas and internet and water is unbelievably stressful. So what we really hope is that there will be policy making at the federal and state level, similar to recent action from the White House that says that people should not be evicted from their homes until the end of the year. We think there needs to be similar policy to make sure that if people are in their homes, they have access to the resources they need to keep the lights on, stay connected to the internet so children can learn from home as they're having to do still. Some common sense things that really need strong policy making.
What are some suggestions that you have for utilities and other industry stakeholders in the energy industry to help financially assist customers or with efficiency? What are some suggestions you have on how they could do a better job meeting the needs of customers during this time?
Well, we've actually been working with a lot of national and state partners to try to encourage at the federal level and then also at the state level here in Georgia for policymakers to make sure that deep understanding of the crisis and how long it might take us to come out of this crisis, so that when policies are made, they're not short-term fixes, but long-term solutions. And in the energy space, we know that one of the best ways to help customers with keeping the lights on is through energy efficiency programs. And here in Georgia, in part because of the pandemic, our investor-owned utility, Georgia Power, has had to suspend most of the programs to help their residential and small business customers lower their power bills by becoming more energy efficient. So we do hope to see that greater efforts will be placed on installing these measures in a safe way in homes of people who have that highest energy burden. And that, again, that high energy burden is people with the small household income, tend to live in, but often living in very inefficient older homes. We get calls from consumers with $500 power bills sometimes their utility bills are higher than the cost of their rent. So we know that it's important to educate consumers about ways that they can take steps themselves to make their power bill be lower. But we also know that there are some needs from professional energy efficiency installers that we want to see happening.
So Liz, we talked about low-income households having a very high energy burden, and particularly those low-income folks who are living in older housing stock. And with both of us being based here in Atlanta, we are familiar with a report that was put out by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on how Atlanta has some of the highest energy burdens in the country. And with this, with a hot summer as well as pandemic and folks being home more often, we're going to probably see even more a higher energy burden as we move through the rest of the summer. So with consumer education around efficiency and budgeting for bills being so important, what's some advice that you can give to utilities and energy industry stakeholders on how to educate customers and help them be more efficient? And also share a little bit more about what Georgia Watch has done in that area.
Well, you're absolutely right. And that study that came out a few years ago had Atlanta ranked, I think, 4th highest of cities in terms of a high energy burden. And the good news is the city of Atlanta, Atlanta Housing Authority, Georgia Power, and advocates like me have been meeting to try to come up with some solutions, again, both historically and then looking forward to how do we prevent that high energy burden from continuing to occur on the same households over and over again. So they look to, certainly the utility is, Georgia Power has some very helpful educational resources. They sometimes include that in bill inserts with suggestions for lowering your power bill. They sometimes come to Georgia Watch. We have workshops that we've put together, or other service organizations. They're also looking in many ways for bill payment assistance. And some of those programs, in fact, as I would say, at least in Georgia, those programs are tapped out. So when we get calls from consumers who are facing a disconnection, they've already tried the faith-based organizations. They've tried the Salvation Army. They've contacted United Way. And the federal dollars that are available through LIHEAP, the Low Income Energy and Heating Assistance Program, are insufficient to meet the needs of Georgians. So that money has been gone through. And so people are really desperate. We had a call yesterday from a woman who's been selling family heirlooms. She lost her electricity, her water, internet, gas, and is getting, she's desperate.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. I mean, SECC did a study that included some figures and stats about LIHEAP in particular, and only about 20% of customers who need it are actually getting it. So we're leaving out 80% of consumers who would qualify for it. There's definitely a need for expansion and some more work in the assistance area. So lastly, I want to bring up the social justice movement of Black Lives Matter. Obviously we're in the midst of a pandemic along with a social justice movement, and that has affected everyone's lives. Can you talk a little bit about how that has affected your work at Georgia Watch, and maybe anything else you wanted to share on things that have been happening around that?
Absolutely. Black Lives Matter is such an important movement, and that the fact that it's intersecting now with the pandemic is a real inflection point, I think we'll see as we look back historically on this year. We know that people who are, we know that Black Americans, as I mentioned earlier, are disparately impacted by these kinds of crises, whether it's in the health or financial space. And what we have been working to do is make sure that when we talk about what consumers need, we actually lead with race. We think it's so important to make it clear that the solutions that we want to see, we need to prioritize the particularly underserved communities or under-resourced communities who have not had access to some of the programs that can help them make their homes more energy efficient. In Georgia, 40% of Georgia Power's customers would qualify, we think, for the LIHEAP program. And there's only actually about 10% of that money available to them. And while there are excellent programs through the Salvation Army and Project Share, which is a way that all Georgians can contribute to assistance for those most struggling to pay their power bills, it's just never enough. And what we found is, and it's also not consistent, whether it's Georgia Power or it's people who are served by their municipality or their elected member co-op. There's not a set policy statewide that gives people confidence that they're not going to have their power shut off in the middle of a pandemic.
Thanks again, Liz, for your time today. We really appreciate you sharing a little bit of your experience with consumers and how they're dealing with this time. And again, thank you for your service as an SCCC board member. We appreciate all your insights there as well. And thanks to everyone joining us and listening in, and I hope everyone has a great day.